After being one of the youngest drivers to ever start a NASCAR Cup Series race, Chuck Bown's career didn't take off the way you would have thought. But after a very successful stint in the Busch Series, Chuck finally got a shot to race full-time in the Cup Series for NASCAR legend Bobby Allison. Unfortunately, after just a dozen races, Bown had a nasty wreck at Pocono. It would leave the driver sidelined for months, battling the effects of a terrible brain injury. This is the story of Chuck Bown and his dance with death at Pocono in 1994. Richard Charles Bown Jr. was born in February of 1954 in Portland, Oregon. Chuck grew up in a racing family. His father, Dick, raced in NASCAR in the lower divisions in the 60s and 70s. His younger brother, Jim, would eventually race in NASCAR too, and be a respectable driver himself. Chuck saw success at the local level, so much so that he would start racing in the Winston West Series in 1970, at just 16 years old. This is the same series his dad made a name for himself in, and obviously the series made geographic sense for the family, since the series stayed in the area. Although he just ran 22 laps between his first two starts, it was incredible to see such a young driver turning laps with the likes of Herschel McGriff and Ray Elder. In 1971, the teenager would collect 7 top 10s and 11 starts in the West Series, racing for his father. Still at just 17 years old, Chuck would make his Cup Series debut. To put this into perspective, you're not even allowed to race in the Cup Series now if you're just 17. You have to be 18. And remember how young Joey Logano was? Well, he was 18 making his first start. Throughout the 70s, a young Chuck Bown would make a handful of starts in the Cup Series, but would make plenty of starts in the Winston West Series. He'd go on to win his first race and the championship in 1976, and he would back it up the next season with a couple of wins and a second-place points finish. But by 1981, Chuck was stuck. He had amassed over 100 starts in the West Series with only 3 career wins. The 27-year-old was 10 years removed from his first Cup race, and although he had collected 3 top 10s, he was only racing a handful of times a year. But then he made a career change that reignited his career. He made a switch to the NASCAR North Tour in 1982, a now defunct series that raced late model sportsman type cars. In 4 years, Chuck won 10 events, putting his name on the map for a ride in one of NASCAR's premier series. In 1986, Chuck would make his debut in the Busch Series at Daytona, where he crashed out. But in his second career start, he made a real splash by winning a race at Oxford. This was an incredible accomplishment, once again in his second career start, beating out a slew of recognizable names. This, unfortunately, wouldn't translate into many more starts, as he struggled to find seat time over the next couple of years. But that would change in 1989, when Hubert Hensley took a chance on Chuck for a full-time gig in what would be life-changing for both parties. After going winless in their first year together in the Busch Series, the pair went on a tear in 1990. They won 6 races and the series championship. In the following 3 years, they'd pick up 4 more wins. And at the end of 1993, Chuck caught the attention of Bobby Allison, who hired him to drive for his team in the Cup Series in 1994. And Chuck, nearing 40 years old, 22 years removed from his first Cup Series start, had finally landed a dream ride. Now, this wasn't a great ride by any means. Outside of Bobby himself, no one had ever won for his team. Racing for Allison, Jimmy Spencer had just come off 10 top 10s in 1993. This showed that they actually had some speed, just not winning speed. Chuck showed a lot of speed early in the season, qualifying in the top 10 in 4 of the first 6 races, including a pole at Bristol. Although this didn't necessarily translate into good finishes, Chuck was showing a lot of potential in his first Cup season. He'd get a season best finish of 7th at Martinsville, and just as the team was putting together solid finishes, Pocono would put their plans to a crashing halt. Just past the 50-lap mark of the race, Chuck found himself losing control of his vehicle in front of Sterling Marlin.
Sterling Marlin get together, Bound backs into the wall, Sterling T-boned him coming into the turn, a hard hit here in the corner in turn 1.
Sterling would clip the right rear of Chuck's car, sending him hard into the outside wall. driver's side first. This was a horrible impact at the end of one of the long Pocono straightaways. Bown climbed from his vehicle, only to appear shaken from the accident. But after being airlifted to a local hospital for an overnight stay, it was found that he had a concussion. Still, Chuck showed up to race at Michigan the next race weekend, but there he was seen with a cast on his right wrist, which would surface as being broken. After practicing the car at Michigan, it was determined that Chuck was still too injured to race. This was because he said he was seeing double on the racetrack. And on Tuesday, after the Michigan race, it was reported that he had actually suffered a broken left ankle as well. Weirdly, 10 days after the wreck, Chuck had multiple major injuries, although initially he had only been diagnosed with a concussion. Then Daytona came around a couple of weeks after the accident. Team owner Bobby Allison, who had also suffered a major wreck at Pocono, pressured Chuck into making the mature decision to sit out. Shortly after, Chuck was slated to start a Winston West race at his home track in Portland, Oregon. This would be a good test to see if he was better, and he wasn't. After a couple of laps in practice, Chuck's vision still wasn't right. A few months later, he tested one of Andy Houston's late model Sportsmans at Hickory, and he was getting better, but he still wasn't 100%. As a result, Chuck did not return to the Cup level for the rest of 1994. In 1995, Chuck would race quite a bit, but he really wasn't the same. He collected the top 10 in the Busch Series, but had an average finish of 31st in the Cup Series. He made a bit of a resurgence in the Truck Series in 1997, collecting 13 top 10s and finishing 9th in points. He got a pole in the opening truck race of the season, but was immediately replaced by a guy named Greg Biffle. The next year in 1999, it was cool to see Bown return to race for Hubert Hensley in the Busch Series, but after 16 races and not a single top 10, he was let go from the team. He was frustrated because he wanted a long-term deal, not just short stints with teams like he had after his 1994 incident. He wanted stability, and he mentioned in an interview with the Scene Vault podcast how he could have tried to will a 30th place car to the front, but it just wasn't something he was interested in. In this interview, Chuck revealed that he believed opportunities dried up because of the Pocono wreck, and maybe even because of how he handled the situation. At the time, it wasn't common for drivers to sit out a long time due to head injuries, and Chuck felt that it was looked at as a sign of weakness, not intelligence. Overall, Chuck was a fast driver who started in NASCAR at a very young age. After a slow start to his career, he had a great run of 5 years in the Busch Series, winning a championship in 10 races. He finally made a full-time transition to the Cup Series in 1994, but that was halted by a horrific wreck at Pocono. After this wreck that threw his career off the rails, he bounced around the NASCAR ladder trying to find a home. And when he didn't, he called it quits to spend more time with his family. And I respect that. But that's it for this video. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure you leave a like and leave a comment down below. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.